Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Seddon and Laceys Comic Stash. And this week, uh, where to start with the X-Men. Before we go into that, Seddon, how the fuck are you all been?
Not bad, mate. Not bad. We've hit shitty weather. I've been walking to work and doing as a smoker, and I don't know whether we should confess that, but I think people who've seen this on the other shows probably realise as a smoker, and I don't even have that long a walk to work. But when I get to work, my hands hurt, and people say to me, "Why do you not wear gloves?" And I have to explain. It's really hard to smoke with gloves on, but other than that, life's been treating me very, very well. How about you?
I hate work.
Mm, mm.
Work can go fuck itself. If I could get paid to sit at home, play PlayStation, read comics all day, I fucking would.
Do you know what? Doing some of this show stuff, and like, it's really been noticeable over. And bearing in mind, this has coincided with a global pandemic, so maybe that's been impactful in some way. But um, watching like lots of movies and TV and reading comics and playing video games, all stuff that I've enjoyed through my life. But I think now that we talk about them more regularly, it reminds me, to the most part, how much I really love it. So then when I have to go and do something else, the work thing, yeah, I get really livid. I just go, how dare you? Well, why can't I just spend my life doing the stuff that's fun? But I guess I do the work stuff to pay for the stuff that is fun. But yeah, my God, it's a chore sometimes.
So, as we introduced last week, it is that time again for Reading Corner.
Sorry, I'm giggling because for anyone who watched it last week, when I was editing the show together, I hadn't really thought anything about it. And when I say editing the show together, open your mind real wide. I don't want it to sound like I'm a pro editor. But when I remembered we had a new section, I thought, oh God, I should probably do like a visual for it. And I could not shake the visual of when I hear the word corner, I hear the bloke in Blair Witch. And so, yeah, like probably not contextually in line with comic books, but yeah, that's why the picture for it is Blair Witch Corner Boy, because that's what corners mean to me.
And moody goth I am, I do like sitting in a darkened corner. So it works on multiple
Yeah,
levels.
yeah. And yeah, that is how I like to. If I think of you at home reading comics, that's what I think you are doing. You are standing facing the corner in a basement. Whereas I'd
Just
like to say
enough
I'm the
light to
same,
read.
but I'm in that imprint that I've made into that couch. That once I get into it, it's very hard to get back out again.
So, what have you been reading in your corner this week?
Well, it's been a strange corner for me this week, and we'll kind of fly through because a lot of the stuff I've been reading this week was, and I'm going to use the term preparation for this show, but then that suggests that we produce a product of a higher standard than we do. But when I was thinking about what I thought would be good starting points for the X-Men, every time I was thinking of one, it kind of piqued my interest. So I went back and read just a handful of issues here and there, some things that I'm going to cover, and also some things that I'm not going to cover because they didn't feel like good starting points. So yeah, rather than ruin what's to come in the show, I'm going to take myself out of the corner and I'm going to place you into the corner. What have you been up to?
So I am still reading 1602. I haven't finished it yet because I had a manic weekend of football and the boy. So my spare time was very limited this week. But I have only got one issue left in it, and then it's vision time.
Are you still enjoying it as much as you said last week? Because I got the
Yeah,
feeling from what you were saying that it's vibed really well with you. Kind of the creative idea behind it and the taking characters and concepts we know and placing it into a different era was really vibing with you.
yeah. The further it goes in, it drops even more characters in. Obviously, I won't go into too
Yeah,
many details because there are sort of moments of like, fuck them,
yeah.
yes, and yes, it's still there and it's still going through it, and it's all going into that last issue there where I think all of the payoffs are going to be. But yeah, no, it is very, very, very clever.
Well, that kind of idea, that alternate universe, or taking something, taking these concepts and placing them in a different time period, be it in the future or the past. We may touch a little bit on a bit of that later in the X-Men stuff, but it's a comic trope and a half, isn't it? But I think when done well, it's really interesting. So
Yeah.
I think I said last week, I've got it teed up to read once I finish Strange Adventures. And bearing in mind I was around when it released, and for some reason it didn't grab me at the time, I'm quite pleased that you've said about it, because I'm now going to visit something that I didn't at the time. So I'm very much looking forward to jumping on that.
Yeah, it's one of those. You know, so they're about tropes, about like basically putting these into a different universe. But usually with those tropes, they are then playing their usual versions of
Yeah,
them
yeah.
in different out of time.
It,
Whereas with this, they are 16th century
yeah,
versions of them in that world. But so one of them, which I will, spoil, just because it doesn't spoil too much in the first chat in the first issue anyway, is Doctor Strange
yeah,
is the Queen's Doctor,
yeah. Which you
and
can
also
kind
known
of,
as a,
when you say it, you kind of go, yeah, I can
yeah,
see how when they were conceiving the story, that's the way you go with that.
yeah, and he also does a bit of magic on the side.
Don't we all?
And then you've got Nick Fury, who's Sir Nicholas Fury, is the Queen's chief spy.
And again, you can see the logic. You can see like
Yeah,
the storyline progression, how it gets that. I mean, I guess one of the things that sort of stands out from what you said about it, and I say about it being a comic book trope, a science fiction trope, um, more often than not, these are used as vehicles of just going, like, let's make the good guy bad and give him a beard, and vice versa. Whereas, yeah, this seems to be by taking it into such a bygone era, it allows for, well, having not read it yet, it suggests to me it allows for taking these characters in a very interesting way. If you go, yeah, they're not Nick Fury now, time traveling back. They are what Nick Fury would be if he was alive in 1603.
yeah. So yeah, that's almost finished. And as I said, I'm then getting onto my Christmas present, and I will start Vision.
Yeah, I'm quite giddy about the idea of you getting to that. But as I say, like giddy with a little bit of apprehension in case you go, this is bollocks. But I do think, I think from knowing what you like, at the very minimum, you will like it, and I think potentially you may end up loving it.
So yeah, so next week's reading corner will be Visions. But
Yeah.
until we get to that,
Well, and you say, like, because I won't be doing such a dent into the X-Men, and as you say, sometimes kind of life supersedes how much I want to read comics, including a 6-hour beautiful experience of trying to get my mother-in-law's iPhone working. And not because I'm technically inept. Let's just say the fault lay elsewhere. But that kind of bites into that time. But certainly the plan is for next week's reading corner is to hopefully have finished Strange Adventures and to have started and hopefully finished 1602, because I want to at least kind of spend a couple of evenings between now and next week's show actually getting to enjoy a bit of reading time.
yeah, I've since Sans Boy this weekend, I will get a bit more time to myself. So, worst case scenario, Sunday will be a day of lounging around, drinking tea, and reading comics.
Well, funnily enough, like in the new world we live in, and I know kind of viewers of this will do very different jobs and things like that. But I work predominantly in an office, and through this time, I've continued to work predominantly in the office. But there are the odd working at home day, and this is in no way to say that when I'm working at home, I don't work or do it. But one of the nice things about working at home is if I'm in the office, I don't take a lunch break, or if I do, it's I quickly run and grab a sandwich and waff it down. Whereas if I'm working from home, I'll actually take a break. And in that break, because I'm in my house with my comic books, it means when I have that break, I can actually do something what I consider productive with my time. I can read an issue, a couple of issues of a comic book. So, and I've got a few working from home days as well. So it allows me to do a bit of lunchtime reading.
Yeah, because I only get half an hour. It's two fags and eat.
Well, and the nice thing is that as you know, most of mine is done on the iPad. So I'm also a two fag luncher like you. but I'll be sat outside in my garden and I'll be reading a comic book whilst doing my smoking part of the lunch break. So it's a great pleasure, that is.
So we will go into the topic of the show for this week, which is where to start with the X-Men. So brief overview of us with X-Men.
Yeah, and I guess I was going to say, Chris, very quickly on that. When we're saying where to start with the X Men, we thought it'd be quite a nice idea to give you an idea of where we are with the X Men, kind of what our experience has been with them so far, and to give you an idea of, I guess, our X knowledge base.
Yes. So obviously, because you'll be leading most of this show, I'll let you go first, so you can then, have a few minutes before going into it. So
yeah, thank you. That's very nice of you.
Where and when did your love of mutants begin?
So I come on board straight up from the comics. So my first experience of the X-Men was through Secret Wars, a show we talked about in the Origin episode, and it was a lot of my first experience for a lot of the Marvel superheroes. But I would say, despite the fact, and I did not know this at the time, that they were the most popular comic franchise in Marvel, and they don't play the biggest part in there. I would say that it certainly leans towards some of the what would be considered the big heroes now, the Hulks, the Captain Americas, but they're in there. So I had a kind of very brief awareness of who some of these characters were, and then when I actually started to be able to buy American comic books, at first, again, not one of the ones I jumped into, but what a beautiful place to enter. I entered at the Mutant Massacre, which was an event that was running through not only X-Men, but X-Factor and New Mutants. Yes, there are multiple spin-offs in the mutant universe. And when I actually picked up the first couple of issues that I read, it was certainly darker and grittier than what I'd been reading at the time. Because I think it was at a particularly dark and gritty moment. You don't call something the Mutant Massacre. It's not all smiles. But I think it kind of grabbed me from that side. And X-Men have got a reputation a lot over the years of having a lot of good artists, but I would say visually appealing artists. And I think the style of art probably even grabbed me before the story. But once I started reading X-Men then, it was a long time before I stopped reading X-Men again. I think that is probably the one that I consistently bought, never put down, and we're looking at probably a burnout point, a good sort of 15, 16 years later before I stopped reading those stories. And of course, as we said with all these things, once I started to get into them, it then made me want to go back and read what I'd missed. So quite an extensive part of the Chris Claremont run, and we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah.
Then there's been some kind of loss of love along the way where maybe I was burnt out, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But then quite often what I've jumped back in on is new starting points, which is quite handy for this show. So, but yeah, I would say I'm a big X-Men fan. I like all of the characters. I'm not saying that everything I've ever read has been brilliant. And of course, we had kind of the multimedia experiences of things like the X-Men movies, which I think there's some good movies, there's some average movies, and there's some toilet ones. So I experienced that side of it as well. And I'm not going to jump into it too much because I think you might go into it. But the outside of the comic book medium, also the 90s X-Men animated show. So yeah, I'd say a big fan, and I have read and own a lot of X-Men. I wouldn't claim to have said that I've read all of it though, because there are certainly some errors where I went, no, not for me, thanks.
So myself, my first interaction with X-Men was the 90s cartoon. You couldn't move for it. It was on every day. And I watched it every day because it was on when I'd get home from school. That was my introduction to them, and you see them in that cartoon in a cartoon form, and they are fucking cool. They are, when you want a cartoon, they are the perfect bunch for it, because you've got the lad with knives for hands, the blue guy, the guy that lobs fire cards, the guy that's got flaming eyes, and I was what, probably about 10, 11 at the time when the cartoon started. It's the shit that you want to see at that age.
And I think, I mean, not that I've revisited it in very recent time, but I do, and there are probably some other cartoons that I'll say the same. That if I did revisit them, they probably wouldn't be so good. But I think it's great. I mean, I think they, um, again, they borrow a lot from much like the Marvel movies do probably so well at the moment. They borrow from large periods of time and then condense that down into, I guess, more palatable stories, but also cut out some of the stuff that maybe wouldn't work so well. And even with the cast of X-Men they've got, those cast of X-Men have all been X-Men, and at certain points, and we will get to some of this, where there's an amazing kind of crossover with this and the animated show. But some of that cast weren't necessarily known for being in it at the same time as each other, and some of those stories like are way out of time. But yeah, I think a great animated show, and weirdly enough, outside of the bulk of what we'll do here, which is comic book starting points, I think this is a brilliant starting point. If you want to get into the X-Men, I think this is a great way to do it. I think, of course, it has that people understand cartoons a little bit easier, or maybe it's an easier transition in. And what a great theme tune as well.
Fucking banger.
Yeah.
And I have watched them recently because they're on Disney Plus.
Yeah.
They hold up.
Well, and I am tempted. I've thought about it a few times. That and God, how we like to digress, but I loved that and the Spider-Man cartoon was at the time. I think during the 90s, it was a kind of real renaissance for cartoons. But I guess maybe it's because they were playing in the worlds that I loved, and maybe that was a renaissance. But yeah, it felt very much like the excitement and the love that I had for the cartoons of the years before, which were like the Transformers and the things like that. It felt like they really clicked into gear again when they found these superhero cartoons.
Yeah, because obviously the 80s you had Masked, Transformers, Thundercats,
He-Man,
stuff to sell toys, not that had any sort of backstory or anything to them. They were just like, we've got these toys, now make a cartoon to sell them.
Yeah.
Whereas in the 90s we got all the superhero cartoons.
Yeah.
Because there were shit tons of stories that they could do and they could make them look pretty. Another one that holds up still is the Fantastic Four.
Yes, I forgot about the Fantastic Four. Yeah,
that still holds up because me and the other half have been watching them in bed recently.
Well, and the real kind of a sort of juxtaposition to what DC were doing with their animated, and again, fantastic. Like Dini's Batman, amazing, and I like the Superman cartoon as well. But it was really nice as a comic book fan because you had two very different styles, didn't you? You had these Marvel ones, which lent more into the 80s cartoons, and you had the DC ones, which were, I guess, they just felt like much more progressive, even though they were speaking to maybe sort of like the 50s and 60s in style. They just felt like more modern because of that, because they're actually making those stylistic choices.
And also fit well with where those characters were at the time. So if you think when the Batman animated series came out, it was just around the point of the Burton films.
Yeah.
So it needed to look sort of 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, it needs to kind of follow that noir kind of more sort of Gotham City being gothic rather than it being the pretty visuals that you see in the X-Men cartoon when you see like the Xavier Institute and all the grass is colourful and like it looks like an appealing place to go if you're a mutant. Whereas Gotham's supposed to look like you don't want to go there.
Yeah. So that was the thing. So you had both sides of like DC and Marvel doing amazing cartoons at the time, but it was through the X-Men cartoon, then because of it being as big as it was, infiltrating arcades with X-Men versus Street Fighter and all that sort of stuff.
And the side-scrolling kind of, like the multiplayer kind of beat 'em up, like the Final Fight style one and stuff like that, yeah.
So that was where X-Men was for me. I would see them in other people's stuff. So there'd be like some Avengers stuff that would have a few of the X-Men in, some Spider-Man stuff that a few of them would turn up every so often. The little the cross play where X-Men would turn
Yeah.
up in someone else's stuff, but I never went, oh, I need to start buying and reading X-Men.
Yeah.
I think that's because, as you say, when you look in at X-Men, there was about 6 or 7 different runs at any one time, and I'm like,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, and it is a big barrier. I mean, again, they're a company trying to make some money, and generally, at most parts, certainly from mid 90s onwards, there are multiple titles called X Men. There are multiple titles that have X Men in it in some way, shape, or form, and yeah, I think it is tough. And funnily enough, when I was putting together my starting points, and I'm sure other people will like have other ideas and probably differences, that was one of the things that struck out for me. Is there are despite my love for it, there are long periods of time between bits where I would suggest people jump in, and I think it's because of that huge universe interdependency on some of the stories that I think it makes some of the, as good as the stories are, I think it makes some of the points to jump in really, really difficult. And I mean, as ever, when we go through some of these, I'll stick up some pictures of some of the collected editions, and I might, even if I'm very clever or if I remember, I might try and maybe put some links to maybe Amazon, or for those that might want to do it digitally, some of the Kindle links or the Comixology links, because it would have been restrictively expensive as well. So, say when you started to watch those animated comics in the 90s, if you wanted to go back to Uncanny X-Men 1, even at that point, or to Giant Size X-Men 1, which we'll get to, you're not doing that as an entry point, because
No.
you're looking at, like, in some cases, hundreds to thousands of pounds at that stage to try and get those issues. And I would say that collected editions were tippy toeing at that point. I think they weren't the monster that they are now. So
No.
yeah, I can see why it would have been hard for someone to get into it at that stage.
And then, obviously, once the cartoon finished, we then got the films.
How and I don't want to kind of necessarily go like to kind of crap on what we're here to do, but how do you feel about the films? Because it's not something that we've ever talked about.
I like X-Men 1.
Yep.
X-Men 2's all right.
Yep.
X-Men 3.
Garbage, isn't it? It's garbage.
Oh,
hot
that's
garbage. Yeah.
that's throwing as much and as many people in as we can just to go look at this.
Yeah.
Wolverine's origin story, the first Wolverine solo, awful, but a wonderful game came out of it. I like the,
and for that, see episode 12.
Yes. I do like the first couple of the re-intro. I don't know. I don't know how it is. If it's like the prequels or what.
Ultimately, they kind of integrated it in, because I think probably I envisaged it to be a prequel, but when they actually started making it, they went, we kind of want to do some stuff with this. But I think as those prequel or the X-Men First Class, let's say, universe, I think they did actually kind of do the steps to integrate it in. But I'm with you. I quite liked the first couple of efforts of that, and it felt like it reinvigorated that as a movie franchise, and it really needed it. I mean, even if you forget the Wolverine ones, that third X-Men Last Stand, I think the third one was, left such a bitter taste that they needed something special, I think, to get audiences back on side. However, the shame of it for me is they kind of did it again. That they kind of knocked the audience into submission again as those went on. I mean, I guess see Renaissance Men podcast for more talk on movies and stuff, but it is something. You don't see many franchises that last beyond a couple of movies without it either starting to drag, or probably the honest truth is the studios are going, we want this to be more sensational, but we want you to spend less money, get it out there.
We want more money to come in and spend less to make.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was one of those. I liked the concept of the as I said the redo ones,
Yeah,
but again they then went and shit the bed.
yeah.
Obviously, everyone is calling for X Men to become part of the official MCU. Um, but my issue with that is who are you going to get to have Wolverine? Because I don't think anyone can take a role like
I,
that that
I'd
isn't Hugh Jackman.
I'd like to, because one of the things that they do in both of the X Men movie franchises is they cover the Phoenix story, and
Yeah,
it is one of the most iconic stories in X Men lore, and one of the most iconic stories in comic book lore. But they just did a really shit job of it on both ends, and I kind of like the idea of seeing what Marvel did with the Thanos, and I don't necessarily want Dark Phoenix to be 25 movies, but seeing what they've done with those characters, I feel like the Marvel Cinematic Universe could do something really, really good with the X Men. However, as you say, I think one of the tough parts is recasting Wolverine, and actually one of the tough parts is how you bring them in. You know, like, do you just kind of multiverse and all of a sudden they're there and you don't have kind of origins for them and you just accept that they're there? Or do you go back to square one with them? And I don't know, it's a tough call, but I do have a bit of faith that there's great movies to be made in that. And I am more confident in the stewardship of those that took the Marvel Cinematic Universe forward more than I am most people. So my fingers are crossed, but yeah, I don't know who you get in as Wolverine.
yeah. Though as long as we don't get what's her face from True Blood as Rogue again.
I didn't mind her as Rogue, but then
Or
to be honest, Rogue wasn't. I think treated particularly well in those movies anyway, so I think
no,
it almost didn't matter who the actress was. But yeah, and I do think we're talking about this now. We would always lean into us loving comics and us finding our love from comics and kind of trying to push people into the reading. But yeah, I do think this is inevitably going to become something that will become mainstream like they did in the 90s if they start showing up in this Marvel Cinematic Universe, wouldn't they? So I think
yeah,
God, if you ever thought as comics as investments, don't wait 5 years to buy any back issues of X Men, like because once that movie's out, no chance. Like if you're gonna buy them now, or probably buy them 20 years ago is the answer. But
yeah.
you can't go in a time machine and do that, unfortunately.
But yeah, it's one of those who said with the reading side of it was more them appearing in other stuff, but
Yeah,
they've always been in my knowledge of who they are. But as I said, even as a kid, and even more so now, I look at it and go, "There's so many different versions. There's so
well,
many different timelines. So many different sort of sets of stuff." And I'm like, Seddon, because I
well,
messaged you before we even started doing the show, and
yeah.
I sort of said to you, "It's like, right, I'm looking at bits and pieces. Where the fuck do I start with X Men?"
Well, and I think the honest truth, going to what you said there, is, and we'll start sort of picking up starting points. But the honest truth is no matter where you start, because of the amount of years they've been around, and because of the amount of really good stories there are for them, um, if you start, there is a lot, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about the X Men is that that there is hundreds and hundreds of issues that I would say are really worth reading, but you can't buy all them at once, and I guess you need to sort of tap in at certain points. And partially, one of the questions you ask yourself is, do they scan so well now? But I mean, yeah, that's the lovely thing about it of going. If you start at some of the starting points and you like it, and I've gone for starting points through the eras purely because I think there is some really good starting points over from 63 onwards. But it does allow you maybe to start at certain points where you don't have to go back and do so much. But yeah, I guess should we jump in? Should we go with what I think would be a good first? Or no, my first idea for a starting point for a reader of the X Men.
Yes, where do we begin?
Let's go back to the beginning. 1963. Stanley, Jack Kirby, oft considered the fathers of a lot of comic books, and certainly the fathers of Marvel. They released the X-Men. Now, I would say this is probably one of my most tentative starting points. And I say tentative starting points because it is an easy starting point, because it is the start of the X-Men. They don't appear anywhere before here. You get this issue, and I say you get this issue, if you start from issue 1 and you're not buying issue 1, you'll be looking to get this in a collected format or digitally. But you get introduced to Angel, Marvel Girl, Iceman, Beast, Cyclops, who for a long period of time are the X-Men. They are the original 5, and also Professor X, who is and he will stay with you for a very, very long time, right the way up to modern day. But he is, I'm going to say, in charge of the X-Men, but he is a teacher, and he wants to teach these young mutants, and mutants are people who are born with a power, born with a gift, let's say, rather than getting it by the bite of a radioactive spider or something akin to that. And we'll get back to mutants and being born with it later, because that comes back a lot later. But it is from the 60s, and it is a simple time. I think where it might struggle for some audiences as a starting point is that they're simple stories. You get introduced to Magneto, you get introduced to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Now, fast forward to now, probably no one's creating a team called the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants anymore, but at the time, it was a little bit more on the nose. And I would say the writing is a lot simpler, but charming, and the art is a lot more basic. But again, charming. It has that charm of the day. But I think if you really want to start with the X-Men, it is a good starting point, because it teaches you who these original X-Men are, how they interplay with each other, and they set up the baseline for what is the X-Men universe and where that goes from beyond. Now, there is a chunk of issues that you can get. There's, as I say, I'll flash up some collected editions and things like that. But as much as I put it as the first starting point, I think just because of historical relevance, I actually would recommend it as maybe you jump back to this after you've seen some of these characters later, because, yeah, as I say, it does. I think it will struggle a little bit more with a modern audience, as this is your 1960s superheroes. They fight a bad person, they win, or they don't win. And Iceman, weirdly enough, doesn't look very icy back then. He looks like he's made of snow, which always amazes me when I go back and read it again, and I remember visually what he looked like back then. But yeah, it's the origin, so it is a decent start point.
Yeah. So is this sort of point where you obviously find out about them being prisoners of the Holocaust and that sort of stuff with Xavier and Magneto, or is it just
you flesh out like Magneto's backstory to those sort of stuff later, and quite a bit later issues wise.
Yeah.
I think, in all honesty, the origins of heroes and villains were a lot simpler then. They start to hint during the initial run of this. There's some connectivity between Magneto and Professor X, but you don't kind of get what runs behind that. And again, the characters are simpler. They're simpler characters for a simpler time. Like, their motivations are quite often be good or be bad. But you do start to see some of these story beats that I think pay off a lot later. But no, like, don't really expect to when we get onto some of the other starting points and we touch on what happens with some of the characters, don't expect that in this early stage. I think this is very much a simpler time and a gentle introduction to the original 5 X-Men.
And a non-blue Beast.
Yeah, he is. I said about Iceman looking like Snowman originally. Yeah, this is non-blue Beast. This is before he gets blue and furry. And again, said it on my top 5 heroes, like the guy has had a tremendous amount of change in his life, but he just has weird feet at this stage and is very acrobatic. The series probably the main focus, I would say, is Professor X, Cyclops, and probably third place on that would be Marvel Girl, and you start to see the seeds of Marvel Girl. Because, like people wanted a bit more, well, I'm not saying they don't now, but people wanted a bit more maybe simplistic romance, and you start to see like a burgeoning romance between Marvel Girl and Cyclops. And in this original run, when I talk about a starting point and how much there is to do, there is sort of, God, I should have checked this, but I think there's 64 issues before it goes on a bit of a hiatus, because it wasn't a big seller. And again, interesting when we touch on the next start point, but it wasn't a huge seller for Marvel. So they actually, at a certain point in the monthlies, they just stopped producing new stories and started reprinting the old ones again, which was an interesting technique. And they did that for a period of time. But you do get some of the people who come in later. So you get introduced to Cyclops' brother called Havoc. You get introduced to Lorna Dane, who's Polaris, and they join the team. And some of the characters that, as I say, play a bigger role later in the universe, they are all introduced here, but I would say not fleshed out until starting point 2 and onwards.
Yeah. One thing, obviously, before we go into the next one, is this still the point where it's a little bit like civil rights movement, or is this free?
I would say that this is the introduction of that as a theory. They do start to touch on kind of mutants being different, and the distinctions between what is a mutant and what is a Spider-Man-esque hero. The radioactive spider, and that people treat them differently. I mean, very much that starts to be introduced as Magneto's motivation of going, despite the fact they're called the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, why are we being treated differently? And I would say you baby step into that, and it probably doesn't get anywhere near as compelling as it does until we shift on a number of years to when that is probably more of the thrust of the mutant story and the X-Men by extension.
Fair enough. So, where to next?
So we jump forward to in comic book time, but of course, like now you'd be looking to do it. But we jump forward to 1975, and what I would call the Chris Claremont era, and others may call it the Giant Size X-Men era, and I'll go into why that is in a minute. But strangely enough, for it being the Claremont era and the distinct amount that he does, the starting point for it, the actual first issue that you would start, but you'd be looking for a collected edition, actually isn't written by Chris Claremont, which always amuses me when I go back and read it. But as I say, in publishing, we'd had this hiatus of the X-Men. They hadn't done anything like kind of new. It showed up in other comics, but they weren't publishing anything new. And then I presume someone in Marvel, when we'd like to do something with the X-Men, we want to bring them back. So they released a special called Giant Size X-Men #1, which was written by Len Wein and drawn by Dave Cockrum. And as I say, what a strange thing to say the Claremont era when it doesn't start with Claremont. But in Giant Size X-Men 1, you get introduced to a new team of X-Men. And the reason why you get introduced is you start off with Cyclops coming back. He's lost his memory, and the other X-Men, the original X-Men, have disappeared. So Professor X needs to get a new band of mutants together to try and save the original X-Men. And why I think this is probably, if you want to get in deep to X-Men, this is the place. This is the best starting point for that, because this is where you get introduced to, and it's not necessarily his debut, but where I think the character goes, you get introduced to Wolverine, you get introduced to Storm, you get introduced to Colossus, you get introduced to Nightcrawler, you get introduced to Thunderbird. Don't get too attached. You get introduced to Banshee, and these, for the longest period of time, are the X-Men, and they go off on a mission. They spoilers. They save the original X-Men, and towards the end of this first issue, like, you've got the original X-Men, you've got these new X-Men, for want of a better term, and you've got Xavier kind of saying, "Well, come on, everyone, let's kind of integrate all this in." And as I say, you lead off from that into the Claremont era, so it jumps back into Uncanny X-Men, the monthly. And as I say, when I put up collecteds, I'll put up some collecteds that cover kind of this first initial part of it. But part of what they do, and I think it's because Chris Claremont wanted to do something different or wanted to take those ideas, is they all leave. The only person who stays is Cyclops, and you almost and Professor X, but you almost get this initial. By this point, Cyclops is the leader of the X-Men,
Yeah.
and you almost kind of see this interdependency that he has, this father-son kind of storyline with him and Professor X. And one of the things they always showed Cyclops as is he has, for those that have seen the movies, and I think it does do this in the movies, he has to wear this visor because he cannot control his powers. And part of the mutant, or part of that early X-Men stuff, was to try and teach young mutants to be able to control their powers, but he can't. So again, I think he always felt this dependency. So he stays to be the leader, and Angel leaves, Iceman leaves, Beast leaves, Jean Grey Marvel Girl leaves, and you then get introduced to this new cast. Now, great starting point. I love it. I will say it shows its age a bit now. I have reread this again quite a few times recently, and I think I mentioned this on the top 5 heroes of as progressive as it seemed at the time. Some of the storytelling techniques, like how to signify that someone is German or Russian. Well, you pick one word that looks German or Russian, and you put a bubble balloon in every other panel to kind of signify that. And I will say on rereads, I go back to basic writing again. Some of this feels out of time for a modern comic book reader. They might kind of go, "Ooh, you know, this is a bit clunky." But for me, this is the X-Men. Chris Claremont stays on this title for time. You know, when I said about if you want something to invest in, not like time into, Chris Claremont does a phenomenal run. I think it ends up being 15 years he writes this for, possibly a little bit longer. I should check that. But yeah, but this is the starting seeds of it. And you get to learn, know, and in my case, love these characters. Now, as we go forward, there is plenty of amazing stories. You know, I said earlier about the Dark Phoenix saga, Days of Future Past being one that is particularly remembered. And there are these tentpole moments that I did consider, like, are they good starting points? But one of the really big things for the Claremont run is he lays seeds for stories that don't pay off for sometimes 5 years.
Yeah.
And when they do pay off, it's fantastic. You know, he really does do long form storytelling well. And that's why I think it's so great. But I think you get into this at the ground floor, you get into his start. And I think if you like it and you want to read more, there are hundreds of issues that you can in collected. But I think I wouldn't jump into most of his run midway because it's so reliant on how those characters got to be who they are by the time those stories pay off. I mean, Dark Phoenix, great story. Dark Phoenix.
That's the thing. I sort of said to you, as
yeah,
should I jump in with Dark Phoenix? Because obviously I know the reputation of it being like the big X-Men story. And you're like, no, don't jump, don't go there.
I think you get a really good story, but I think without the without how Jean Grey comes back to the X-Men, without how she becomes the Phoenix, and without how she becomes Dark Phoenix, if you look at like a trade of Dark Phoenix, it will just kind of be the last 5 issues, which are great. But I think it loses so much without that precursor. So again, there is in that Claremont era, I think there is only one major starting point for me, and that is the beginning. Because I think if you jump in anywhere else, you lose a bit of the effectiveness of the story, but I think it will make you inclined to jump back. Now, I was quite lucky, as I said, and there are some collected editions of this, I'll put it up. When I started with the Mutant Massacre, which would have been 130 issues into Chris Claremont's run, at the same time, Marvel, lovingly, were doing a monthly reprint called Classic X-Men, which reprinted from Giant Size X-Men onwards. So actually, each month I was reading what's happening now and what was happening in the past. Yeah. So I was kind of coming at both sides of that story. But this guy, Claremont made the X-Men. Like, so all of the ones you see in the movies were either birthed from the mind of Claremont and whatever artist he was with at the time, or he'd taken them into his story and made them into the characters you see. So and we'll get in a little bit more into the cartoon. I'll go to the movies first. But those characters you see in the movies, they don't get into the movie without this Claremont run. And Yeah, there's not many. In fact, there's not a single other comic run that I would say runs for as long as his does, and it maintained quality, except for right towards the end when it goes a little bit wonky. But by that stage, one thing that I did
After
promise.
15 years, you've got to expect it.
Well, and one thing I did promise a lad that I work with when I was talking about the Chris Claremont, and he said he shares the same love with me. Is for as much as one of the things I really like about it is it laying down story beats that you might have to wait 4 or 5 years to pay off, but when it does, you go brilliantly. There are also story beats that he lays down that never pay off, because I think in that longer run, like there's stuff that just gets put to the wayside, or he never gets a chance to get back to it.
Yeah.
Um, while I wax lyrical about it, as I said, like that first part, you start there, and I think that's a great way to start. And I would say maybe a simpler writing style for what the modern audience will. But I will warn, one thing that Claremont does throughout it is a wordy bugger, and I think he is prone to using 50 words, and maybe this is why I like him, because I like this as well, using 50 words when a couple of words would suffice. But yeah, this is a great starting point because it leads you on to so many amazing stories, and the amazing stories that took this from a comic that was being reprinted because it was so undervalued to being the biggest thing Marvel had.
Yeah.
And again, context wise, before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, X-Men was it. And when I say X-Men was it, X-Men had been the best selling comic book for 20 plus years. And that's because of this stuff. So yeah, a wonderful story. Going on to something you mentioned earlier about the kind of civil rights things. So what this run does, and you won't get it in maybe the first collective, but again, the big build, this is when you really start to see mutants being treated differently. This is the era when we lean into the equivalent of, let's say, like kind of a race war. So the motivation moves away from we just want to be good. It's like we want to prove that mutants are good because you, the general public, hate mutants, and you hate us because we were born different to you. And this is where you get the big fleshing out of Magneto. No longer is he necessarily the skullduggery bad man with a helmet. He has motivation. His motivations are my species is being treated really badly. So actually, when I do bad things, it's because you've done bad things to me first, and it's where you start to sort of find out his past, and his past being that of a Holocaust survivor and things like that, to give that extra flavour and context to why he's motivated how he is.
I was going to say, 'cause it's one of those. I remember when watching the cartoon, and one of my mate's older brothers, because he was like 5 years older than us, sort of when it was at the time, Magneto and Xavier were basically Malcolm X
Yeah,
and Martin
Luther King. Yeah, yeah.
in comic book form.
And it really is. And I'm not saying every issue is that. I'm not saying get prepared for that deep political, philosophical question for all of it. But bearing in mind the era that this was published, we said, I think, when we were talking about some of the Batman stuff, especially things like kind of the Killing Joke and Year One of going, people weren't doing this with superhero comics. So, but also kind of don't put, if you've read some of the stuff, let's say the last 5 years, don't necessarily expect it that. This kind of builds over 40, 50 issues because that's how comic storytelling was. But yeah, that is the perfect analogy. And I'm sure when he was writing it, that's exactly what he thought. He went, here we are, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, in the world of superheroes. And as I say, like you get to see that growth. Again, comic books of the time were probably more about maybe Spider-Man in the Marvel universe might slightly kind of argue this, but I was an Avengers reader at the time, and generally it was who's the next big bad, who's the next big threat. Whereas X-Men was about they are a family. They're an odd family brought together by the fact that the world hates them. I mean, quite often that is actually said, like, they are the heroes for the world that hates them. But you get to know them as characters, and despite some clunky writing, I'll be honest on that, when you go back, some of it's clunky, you get well-rounded characters. Like the Wolverine you see now the best he is at what he does and things like that. That all come out of this era, and
Yeah.
I think they were quite clever with him because you start to see that he's often treated like an animal because he's got these instincts that overtake him, but you get to see that human side of him. You know, that thing of like when the regret after he's lost it, and there's some great interplay between him and Cyclops because you've got Cyclops who's the ultra good boy leader, and you have this kind of rabid Wolverine who often loses it, and you get this sort of great loggerheads and spoilers. Then Jean Grey, who has always been Cyclops' girlfriend, gets involved, and you get a love triangle. And when I
Yeah.
say a love triangle, actually a very interesting and well portrayed one because it's not just who do I love? You know, like they flesh it out, and you start to see these characters as three-dimensional characters, which I think a lot of comics weren't doing back then.
Yeah. And the other thing is with this era, this is the one that has defined their look as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Every character's look from here is what they definitely were in the cartoon.
yeah,
Most of them still are the same now.
yes, yeah,
Obviously, there are some that have changed slightly or altered to be a bit more modern with times. But
yeah,
that classic X-Men look,
yeah,
was started here, and because obviously I sort of had a scan through bits obviously you sent over,
yeah,
and I was like, that's where that look came from.
yeah.
And yeah, so this is one of the ones that is in my
Well,
Amazon basket at the moment.
now, and again, because there's a reasonably priced one at the moment as well. Now, weirdly enough, before you buy this because I think you'll like it. My third starting point is quite an odd one, and it's something that's very recent, but it's relevant to this. And I think it's something that I mean I certainly missed it. One day I was around a friend's house, and again when I say one day I was around a friend's house, going back a couple of years now when I used to go around friends' houses, and I saw this thing on
the apocalypse.
pre the apocalypse. I saw this thing on his coffee table called X-Men Grand Design, and I thought, what's this? And I saw the name on the cover. It's Ed Piskor, and I'd read he'd done a thing called Hip Hop Family Tree, and I'm a big rap fan. And you say to me, let's do like a kind of historical walkthrough hip hop in comic book form. I'm there. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah.
But he does this for X-Men. Now, you know when I said there are like close to 20 years worth of Chris Claremont stuff. And again, so let's say it like the jumping in point is Ed Piskor's Grand Designs. Now, what Ed Piskor does is he takes the Claremont era and condenses it into a lot less. So you're not getting necessarily all the story beats. So, for example, like 5 issues of Claremont's run might be 2 pages in this. But he gives you the whole story, and he gives you kind of all the story beats, all the character stuff, a very quirky, interesting art style. But I think it's a good starting point because it covers such a vast era of X-Men in a very palatable, very different, more modern form. But you do get all those story beats in there. So yeah, it's very interesting from that point. So I think potentially I would always advise go back, start the Claremont run at the start and work your way through it. But if you maybe want to do a bit of a try before you buy, okay, it might spoil a few things to come. But of course, these are 40-year-old comics at this point. So movies and the animated series will have spoiled a lot of the story beats anyway. But this is a really interesting starting point for me for something where you could go, oh God, I could get a really good idea of what happened over a long period of time in X-Men, and I could potentially make my decision as to whether I want to go back and read the individual issues this way. But yeah, I think it holds. And when I say the story beats, you know, it hits the big story beats and the big character beats, and oh God, it looks beautiful.
See, this was the one of the list I looked at because I couldn't find anywhere that actually had a breakdown of what it was. I've only seen the cover.
Yeah.
I went, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
And obviously Grand Design, I was like, oh, was it sort of makeover program.
Well, it does sound like that, doesn't it? Like, and I think
Yeah,
that's why I hadn't noticed it when it came out. I had no idea what it was, because I just assumed it was probably going to be like a limited series where, I don't know, it's someone's take on it, or someone's got a story to tell, or yeah, they're going to redo the X Mansion, and this is the way that they do it. So it passed me by, but yeah, it's 15 years worth of comic book history condensed into much smaller, and I say smaller page wise, not tiny, like much smaller page count, to give you an idea of what happened. And of course, because it's someone who's writing this and drawing this who clearly had a love for it, you can feel that love coming out of the page. It's done with a lot of reverence.
yeah,
But yeah, a great start point for me. Although arguably the one thing I'd say as an aside to it as a start point is, it could prevent you from actually going back, because you, as I say, you've seen all the big stories play out, maybe on one page rather than across 5 issues. But yeah, I would heartily recommend it, and it it doesn't not tell the stories, but because it's written now, I think you lose some of that clunkiness on the page, or some of the clunkiness of saying the same Russian term over and over again is done with a nice touch of humour in this, rather than it being a story crux.
Okay.
But yeah, very, very.
I might have to change my.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think, yeah, for a modern audience, it's a great way of jumping in or deciding whether you want to jump in. The only other thing I wanted to, and I am going to jump forward many, many years in a minute to the next one. The only thing is, and I know I mentioned it earlier, I think a lot of people would say there's some big hits that you can do in this era. As I said earlier, Days of Future Past, very big story. The Dark Phoenix, as I said, one of my jumping points was Mutant Massacres. And in this world, this is where, as we get into the early 90s, because the X-Men as a franchise is so popular, you start to get into mass crossovers, and that they could be considered jumping in points, because I think you get to see a load of the characters in one go. I haven't put those ones in because, as I said earlier, I think they pay off better if you see what built to them. But there is one story that is kind of almost an honourable mention starting point from this era, and it was a graphic novel. And when we talk about terminology of comic books, graphic novels were produced singly, so they weren't a collection of pre-done issues. But during this era, you have, again, Chris Claremont written, you have God Loves, Man Kills. I almost wanted to do it as a starting point, but again, I think it means so much more if you've read Claremont up to that, but you're not relying on that. But God Love Man Kills really does single into the hatred of mutants, that side of it, and the militancy of what people can do. And I think it's a nice kind of condensed way of getting you into what the plight of a mutant is. But it only comes in as an honourable mention because, as I say, I think it still means more if you've read the Claremont run before it, but not essential to have read the Claremont run before it.
So that's another one to put on there. That just sounds like
sorry,
there's killing in it.
Oh,
Kills
dear,
in the title.
Like, your Amazon it's fantastic as well. And I will say, I won't go into particular, but one of the X-Men movies does borrow some plot points from this, but does it quite poorly compared to the source material. So
by this point, my Amazon list, my birthday's in May. I will quite happily put it up there, and you can feel your
all of the best birthdays are in May, because my birthday is also in May. So May children were the best. And that again, that's one of the problems, isn't it? Once you start to kind of unpick at this stuff, you kind of going back to what we said earlier. When will you have the time, but also how will you get the money to pay for all this stuff? But so my next starting point, and this is one that particularly resonated with me because of our discussion with the X-Men animated show. So we jump forward to comic book boom time. This is when comic books started to sell millions of copies, and this is the run that's often referred to as Mutant Genesis. And again, I think the collected editions are called Mutant Genesis. Now, technically, this is still the Chris Claremont run, but we move into the Jim Lee Chris Claremont run. So X-Men is not only the most popular franchise out there, but X-Men #1, which is the relaunch, the Chris Claremont Jim Lee one. That's where we get into the I think it's 4.5 million copies of this issue were sold. This was a zeitgeist moment, but also what it was is, and why I think it's a good start point, is Claremont had been on the book for many years at this point, and as I say, there were tons of plot points and tons of history, but this was them not rebooting, but I think giving you as a reader a chance to start again. So the characters' histories are still there, and I think having a knowledge of those characters' histories were beneficial, but not essential anymore. You got introduced to this team of X-Men that were new, but they're not new like giant size X-Men were. It is Wolverine, it is Marvel Girl, it is Cyclops, it is Rogue, it is all of the characters that if you'd read the Claremont run, they're still there. But they moved a little bit away from being so reliant on the historical stuff was there. And yeah, you know, like it was an attempt, I think, for, and don't get me wrong, it's an attempt to make a fuckload of money because they knew if they released an issue 1, it would. But I do think it actually stands up as a refresh point to the X-Men universe.
So it's basically their version of the New 52.
No, I mean, not even that far. I mean, literally, if you were reading Claremont stuff at the time, the issue before ends, and then the next month there is, and there's Uncanny X-Men carries on, but there is a blue team and there is a gold team. So by this time, there are many mutants in the world, and there are many popular mutants. But this allowed them to kind of split them into 2 teams, and you could read the blue team or you could read the gold team. Blue team was in, I'm trying to remember which way around it was. I think blue team was in Uncanny, gold team was in X-Men. But it was, so the history doesn't go away. I think they just kind of go a little bit less important because there's 2 teams now. You're seeing different interactions with these guys. Join us from here. And one of the reasons why it's a good starting point is during this and during the trades of this, Chris Claremont leaves the X-Men. He doesn't, and behind the scenes, he has a falling out because Jim Lee, as the superstar artist, started to become a bit more powerful. And I think because Chris Claremont had done so much for the company over the years and created this, he didn't take too kindly to having other voices. And as I say, that's why I think it's a good jumping on point because other writers come in and they don't rely so much on Claremont's storytelling ways. The characters are still there, but you start to get some new stories. I would say that it's very 90s tastic. You know, like you do get a lot of kind of I would say action scenes become more important than maybe the character moments. And I think during the Claremont run, you could argue that there's some melodrama in there. You know, where I talk about character development, I think this becomes a lot more kind of a melodramatic. Like if there's a love story, like the end of the issue will hinge on are they going to kiss, aren't they going to kiss? But then the next issue will hinge on is someone going to die or aren't they going to die?
Yeah.
And I think it's much more that 90s storytelling tropes. But again, a good jumping on point. If that's the sort of thing you like, I think if you lean more into the action heavy and when I say about why I think this is a good jumping on point for those that like the animated series is most of the character designs like for that animated series come from Jim Lee's drawings for this comic book. You know, that was their pure inspiration for all of the characters in. So I think there's that familiarity for anyone who is the cartoon fan where they can jump into here and go, yes, these are the characters I know from the cartoon and follow the stories on from that point.
Yeah. So that one needs to go in the list then.
I mean, to be honest, Chris, as much as I'm saying as a starting point, that's not one of the starting points I think I would recommend to you. I think that bit might leave you a bit colder because, like, knowing kind of the stuff that you like, I think it might be a little bit too popcorn action-rific.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's a great starting point if you love popcorn action-rific stuff. But yeah, certainly from a visual stance, this is what the animated stuff looked like, and yeah, you know, it's a good starter for that reason and that reason alone.
So the next one is the one that I'm really, really intrigued about.
Well, before we get to the next one, I said like how I'd read a ton. I
Yeah,
drop off. I still stay on for a while, and I still buy far too many of these. But I drop off somewhere between Claremont and the next one, because I think sometimes what you have is when you don't have that singular distinct voice, and there were lots of writers jumping on and off, and as I say, it was a lot more popcorn-esque, and we were in the world of like novelty covers and events every sort of 5 to 6 months. I really got burnt out somewhere between here and where we get to our next starting point. So this starting point means a lot to me because it's what brought me back to X-Men. And that
so
is
yeah,
Grant Morrison coming in to do what was called New X-Men, and it was called New X-Men. The X-Men series had been X-Men, but all of a sudden you had this word "new" on the cover, and Grant Morrison, fantastic writer, and well, I'm going to say fantastic writer. He is a fantastic writer, but I'm sure we'll do more Grant Morrison stuff later, and we'll probably flesh out a little bit more about Grant Morrison, but he had recently come off of a successful, let's say, retooling of the Justice League.
yeah,
And so Marvel went, let's get on grubby little mitts onto Grant. Let's bring him over and see what he can do with the X-Men. And so this is a really good starting point because he was brought in to, let's say, refresh and reinvigorate. So there is no reboot. The histories aren't there anymore. But they said, come over here and make this title compelling, interesting, get us our audience back. And that's why it's a great starting point. He dips into all of the history, gives it his own twang, which really, really is fantastic through some of it. But he tells you what you need to know as you go through.
yeah.
So the fact that there's 40 years of publishing of Wolverine at this point, he'll let you know what Wolverine you're seeing early doors in it, and why these characters and what their motivations are, because we are into, I think, the world of the modern written comic book at this time. So they are giving you smart story beats, and they are giving you the information you need to know about these characters, and it looks beautiful. This is where we get some really interesting character redesigns on characters such as the Beast. So he's been blue and furry for many years, but he's been very static blue and furry. But here you see him become a lot more animalistic. And one of the opening tenets for the Grant Morrison run is the term secondary mutations. So up until now, they've been mutants. They have their powers. Whereas here, he kind of introduces this idea of going, yeah, but if you mutate, why would you necessarily stop mutating? So as I say, Beast becomes more animalistic in not only his appearance, but over time his kind of personality. You see Emma Frost, who had always, the White Queen, as she's often known, she had always just been a lass with psychic powers, but actually her secondary mutation is she can then turn her body into diamond form, and you get lots of bits like this introducing. And Grant Morrison's writing style is often, or can be, quite kooky. So when I say this is brilliant, and it is brilliant, Chris, you'll love this. There are some moments where it goes a little bit wibbly wobbly. He gets a little bit carried away with an idea, and maybe it doesn't stick as well as it should. But you would accept some wibbly wobbly when I think someone at its core has a bit of genius about them. But yeah, he goes back to the mutants being distrusted, where I think the gap in between, as I say, a bit more popcorny, they relied on that a little bit less. But I think where he really focused in on that is he makes them more insular. So the Xavier's Institute had pretty much just had the X-Men in it for a long time, and some of the other teams, New Mutants. Like in this is a school. This has hundreds and hundreds of mutants living in it. And so you get introduced to all these wide characters, and he leans into them being a little bit more odder in appearance. But you start to see this: what happens when mutants become a community of their own. Now, that might seem a bit strange for people who've read this. You might go, well, "You're totally getting that wrong," because there was a country full of mutants, and that's a very big part of the first story. But I think this is him taking that concept and going, "Okay, let's look at these mutants. This school as a school, and mutants as a community." But yeah, it is wonderful, Chris. It is absolutely breathtaking, and as I say, brought me back into the X-Men universe and made me want to read more again.
Yeah. So see, I know Grant Morrison from some of his Batman stuff
Yeah,
and the Justice League bits, and I like his writing style. Because he did a lot of the stuff around the time of the animated Batman animated series stuff being done. The comics at that time
yeah,
was his. So I read bits then, and that was when I saw the name. And I was like, I think that's who I think it is. And I
it
sort
is. Yeah,
of went, oh, yep, it's the one that did the Batman stuff that I liked and got me into reading Batman as a kid. So that's the one where I was like, I'm tempted by this one because of the fact that it's Grant Morrison. Um, and then after this one is another one that I'm just
well,
like,
I was going to say, before we jump onto the other one, there's only one bit that I kind of wanted to, when I talk about starting points, that I wanted to kind of cover as well, is that, like, I said for the last one, like the style of how the characters looked in the X-Men animated very much come from that Jim Lee era. And that had continued. So, like you got people with like the age old like piss take one of like loads of pockets and colourful costumes and things like that.
yeah,
One of the things that Morrison does in this, and Frank Quietly, the artist who certainly starts on it, and we do have a bit of a rotating cast of artists, they go back to, I would describe as a more uniform and possibly a more military one. So they go to pretty much black leather with a yellow X on it, depending on where it is. And this is, the movies took their inspiration for their costumes from this run.
yeah,
And I think actually, bizarrely enough, the new X-Men run of Grant Morrison, as much as the stories don't cross over with the movies, I don't necessarily think the movies would have happened or potentially wouldn't have looked like they did without this run of Grant Morrison's. And if there's if there's any testament I can say to why I think this is a good starting point, is up until my last one, not jumping too far ahead, I will come back to that. I would say that most X-Men stories post this Grant Morrison run borrow from this Grant Morrison run. So he
yeah.
introduces a ton of ideas into this universe that, and this was 2001 that he started doing this. So I would say up to like 19 years later, people were still heavily using this in the same way as the Claremont run was amazingly influential, but Claremont was writing it, so of course it was. This changed X-Men comics for the next 20 years until, let's say, very recent times.
So yes, that's another one that's definitely on the list
Yeah.
as a start point.
That one, I would say, when I was hunting for collected editions of this one, there are a few out there, but it seems to be one of the ones that is actually at the moment quite hard to get a hold of in some of the sort of cheaper trade paperback ones. It seems to be a lot more collecting his whole run into big bad boys. So yeah, potentially just keep your eye, if it's something you want to. I think maybe it'll be a keep your eyes peeled for seeing one on maybe Amazon Marketplace at a reasonable price and things like that, because it doesn't seem to be a lot of in print trades from this at the moment.
Yeah, that's the one that, because when I was looking at them, yeah. That being said, E for Extraction is only £4.11.
Yeah, but like when you're kind of going through and you're going, there's a lot of volumes here that are kind of not readily available, but I think they sort of come
Yeah,
in and out because again it is I guess it is an evergreen, but yeah, just slightly keep your eyes peeled on this one. Or I meant to say this on some of the others, and as I say, I will put them up on the screen for those that do use things like Amazon Prime and things like that. Some of these runs, the initial parts of them, are available for now on through Prime, or you can generally get them quite cheaply on Comixology.
See, this is why I should get into digital, but I struggle.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, like, but also, like, we say that. I mean, if everyone goes full digital, then I think print dies, and I think if print dies, these stories die, because I don't think it's necessarily sustainable. I think you need that print part of it. But yeah, you know, it potentially is a certainly, as I said, now that you're adding tons and tons of things to this wish list, like, because there's so much to it that maybe this is the sort of thing that leans heavily into being able to do it digitally.
Yeah. Yeah, the next one also you had me in because who the writer is.
Yeah, I mean, like, from going from a series that had a singular writer for so long, and then very much like the guys who come in were comic book writers, right the way up to Grant Morrison. Then we jump not too far ahead in actual time, but we jump forward to a series called Astonishing X-Men, and this was bringing Joss Whedon. Joss Whedon will always be of Buffy fame for me. I know people have other loves, but Joss Whedon
Firefly.
Joss Whedon is Buffy, and Buffy is Joss Whedon. Yeah, they brought in a TV writer, and strangely enough, I won't go into this too deeply because you know the focus is new. But rumor has it that actually they wanted to get Joss Whedon in to do his run before the Grant Morrison one. And I say before the Grant Morrison one, when they'd had this idea of we want to reinvigorate X-Men and probably bring people back in, they approached Joss Whedon, but I can't remember. I think he was working on something at the time. It possibly was even Firefly, but he was too committed to TV stuff, so he couldn't. So that's why they moved and did the Grant Morrison run. But after Grant Morrison left, they wanted to follow that up with something. Now, I've just waxed lyrical about what an amazing starting point New X-Men is, and how good Grant Morrison was, and how that laid the groundwork for everything else. And here I am pretty much straight afterwards going, and the next run, which is this Joss Whedon one, again, I think it is a wonderful start point. It's a much shorter run, which I think is quite handy for someone who would want to get in and get out. It is in continuity. It has the characters that you either know and love at this point, or you would see in any others. So it has Cyclops, it has Beast, it has Emma Frost, it has a lot of the characters that Grant Morrison used. But again, where I think Joss Whedon, and probably through the stuff that he's done in TV, does fantastically well is he knows these characters, he loves these characters, and his stories do rely on history, but he gives you the story beats you need to know, and he gives you the character beats you need to know. So you're not by page 2 going, I've got no idea who this is, what their motivations are, or why they're heading in that direction.
Yeah.
He gives you that, but also if you're a long time reader, like if you have come through all the others, you still love it because it's not told so ham-fistedly that you're going, I know all this shit. Why are you telling me this again? But this is amazing. Like I go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I didn't think anything could follow Grant Morrison, and this did. And it stands up toe to toe with Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison probably introduced more interesting concepts to the X universe in his run, but this is superhero storytelling done amazingly well.
Yeah,
you know, like you get the beginning, the middle, and the end of these stories, and they are. When I said about that era of the popcorn, this has some popcorn-esque elements to it, but told smartly with a real. He pulls you into who these characters are. So if you weren't already invested in them, by certain points, you'll be going, "You bastard! I love that person," in a very Buffy, Firefly, Joss Whedon way.
yeah. It's like other than Angel, but I think that's because it wasn't aimed for me, and I never really heard Angel when he was in Buffy anyway. I was more of a Spike guy. Everything that Joss Whedon's done, TV wise, has been good.
Thank God you clarified that because I was just going to destroy you for Justice League the movie then.
But it's one of those of in his hands. I was like, I want to know what he would do with the X-Men.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, contextually, I guess it doesn't work for you because you've not read Chris Claremont, but this felt like a love letter to the Chris Claremont run. This felt like a very, very, I keep using the term smart, but a very smart writer coming on and going, I love these characters. I love the way these stories were told. And I'm going to tell it in my way with a much more modern storytelling style to it. And knock your socks off. And as I say, I think why it's a good starting point is it is fantastic. And you don't need to have read 25 years worth of comics to understand it. It helps if you've read 25 years, but you don't need that 25 years at all. And I think he does 24 issues in total. And but to be honest, I think if you just read the first 6, certainly if you read the first 12, I think even with those you can walk away and go, I'm really happy with what I had there. But also you can go on and read the 24. And I say about all the concepts that Morrison added in. Don't get me wrong, Whedon adds in some characters and some character concepts that are also very interesting and are still about to this day. So well done to Joss Whedon. But and also if you're a Buffy fan, if you're a Firefly fan, and you don't know that Joss Whedon had done comics, this is a great Joss Whedon comic for you to start on.
So last but not least on your list, something that I failed to do with the Batman ones was find something new as a jump in.
But I won't say that's because I was smart or anything. Just luckily, we've got a very new jump on point. So the comic book industry is what it is, and it doesn't sell anywhere near the issues it deserves, considering the movies and things like that. But I would say, from a Marvel perspective, between Morrison and that Whedon run, and now, we had the almighty juggernaut that was the Marvel Cinematic Universe come chugging along, and so a lot of focus in the Marvel publishing line has been directed towards Avengers, Cap, Thor,
Guardians,
Iron Man, yeah. So I think the X-Men were kind of, and they've kept they still sell well in a comic book world, but for a long period of time they were kind of off to the side, and between that time we've had quite a few reboots, retellings, new writers coming on, and I'm sure there's some people who have some love for those runs who might pick them out as good starting points, but none of them seem to have stuck for me. None of them have had that gravitas of the Claremont, the Morrison, the Whedon era. But in very recent time, and God, I think I've got it here. I'm trying to remember what year this came out. 2019. The Marvel brought in a writer called Jonathan Hickman to take over the X universe. Jonathan Hickman, from a comic book storytelling point of view, had a very long run on Fantastic Four and an amazing run on the Avengers comic, which led to a very big event. And I think he is an amazing writer. We will do more Hickman down the line. We will get to some Hickman stuff. But he kind of hadn't been playing in the Marvel. I think he was kind of burnt out after doing this massive Avengers run. He'd gone to some creator owned. So when I heard that they were bringing him into the X universe, I was very interested. I was like, here's a writer I love with characters I love. And so for the next jumping on point, it is 2 limited series, so 2 6-issue series, but there's a lot of collective where they put them together. And it is House of X and Powers of 10, although it is shown as an X, but it's pronounced Powers of 10. Jonathan Hickman comes in and he fundamentally changes the X-Men universe like that in an amazing kind of storytelling bit. It is still Professor X, it is Magneto, it is Wolverine, it is Cyclops, but somehow he managed to almost come in with a broom and go, everything changes while some of it stays the same. So mutants are moved much more back into the kind of a different species, and those divisions being there. But somehow he takes old concepts and makes them wonderfully new again. And there's a particular bit that I don't want to even mention, because I don't want to even get close to spoiling it, because for someone who'd read, let's say, 30 years worth of X-Men, he does a bit in this in House of X in particular, where I just go, fucking hell, that's brilliant, huh? I've never thought of that. But I do want to kind of touch on some of the stuff he does as a selling point for a starting point. So, comic books love killing characters and then coming back. it's always been a trope and things like that. One of the things that Hickman does in this is he gives a fundamental reason why no X-Men will die. That's a lie.
Okay.
X-Men will die, but they will come back to life, and he explains why they will come back to life. And he uses 5 obscure characters from the X-Men universe that have rarely been used everywhere, and by a combination of those powers, they do this thing called the resurrection protocols. And it shows that, like, say you're a mutant, you go out tomorrow, you get killed, it's fine, they'll just resurrect you the next day. But it's a new you, it's almost a clone, but by combining these mutants' powers, it allows for it to be a perfect clone for you, where you remember what everything you've done up until you die. Now, this might sound like a strange concept because you go, well, you take death out of the equation, but that's the sort of breath of fresh air that he brings into the story. So when you've got those sort of things going on, and the other big thing they do is, so we jump back to Giant Size X-Men 1, where I say that the original X-Men had been kidnapped. They'd been kidnapped by something called Krakoa, which is a living island. Again, bearing in mind it's the 70s, so you get concepts like that. So fast forward to 2019, one of the first things that happens is Professor X sends a message out to the world and says, no more, like, because he's telepathic, no more, you do not mess with mutants anymore. We are going to Krakoa. We are going to live on Krakoa. Every mutant is welcome here. And bearing in mind, we are better than you. We are mutants, we are superior, but we don't want to fight you, but we are going to be over here. Do not mess with us. Actually, though, what we're also going to do is they establish themselves as a proper country, and they go, we want trade routes, we want all these sort of things. And because we have all of these powers and we have all of these things that we can do, we will do things like we will cure cancer, but we will only give you the medication if, like you parlay politically into agreeing that you won't mess with us anymore. And that's kind of our starting point for this new world of the X-Men. They are all there, and I say every mutant, the concept is that every mutant, be them historically good guys or bad guys, they can come and live in peace on Krakoa. And I say Krakoa, they have gateways to other bits, like they have a base on the moon where some of them live, but they establish the mutants as I want to say a nation, but a force, a species that actually is out there. And when I say House of X and Powers of 10, one of the differences is House of X is telling you kind of how mutant world will be now. Powers of 10 is actually in the future, and Powers of 10 shows you some of the perils to come. And you kind of see this world where maybe the man versus mutant argument becomes less important over the time because man becomes obsolete, and it becomes things like mutant versus machine. Because, we've all seen Terminator. We all know that one day Skynet is going to take over. So it changes that long-term peril, but it introduces some interesting concepts. So you do kind of have this mystery of going, what is Professor X up to? Because he seems quite a bit different than Professor X that we have seen historically. He is working with Magneto. All of the villains are coming in, and it's got this nice kind of uncertainty, unsettling part of it of going, these are the characters I know and love, but I'm not so sure whether I'm supposed to love them anymore, because it feels like there's some sinister stuff going on here. But also, some of them, there aren't some sinister stuff. They just want to go and live somewhere peacefully. And House of X and Powers of X, as I say, are collected quite extensively. And then from that, in Marvel Publishing, they then start off X-Men from an issue 1, and Hickman writes that. And there are a plethora of mutant-related sort of trades that come after that in this kind of Hickman verse. But yeah, a wonderful starting point, because I think it reinvents the mutant world, but without forgetting the history.
That one sounds different.
It is. Yeah.
I think that's one of those. If I was going to go, I don't think I'd start on that one first. I think I'd sort of do some of the older ones first. But if I was then going to go, do you know what? Fuck it. Let's see what they're up to now. Then,
well, I think, from a start,
that could be a jump into then buying loads and needing extra shelving. Yeah.
Well, from a starting point, I think why it stands out as a starting point is again, like I said, with Grant Morrison and the Joss Whedon, is despite there being tons of history, he tells you what you need to know. And again, having 30 years worth of history makes some of those story beats more powerful, more interesting. But you could jump into this, and don't get me wrong, you jump into it, and I think a lot of it you'd be going, "What the fuck is going on?" But in the same way as someone with 30 plus years, I was also going, "What the fuck is going on?" Because everything is new,
Yeah.
except for the characters. But yeah, some great stuff. And I would say, I mean, I've read quite a bit of this post. This really, after a lapse again of many years of reading X-Men, somewhere post Whedon, this was the one that got me back in again, and it is great. And because it is very modern, you could get caught up relatively quickly if you had a lot of time and money, because stuff has only been coming out for like 2 years. But yeah, it would allow you the ability to read it in a modern world.
So lots and lots and lots of start points and lots of money on my Amazon list.
I mean, I know we said this. I mean, Batman, I guess, is when we did the Batman one. I think Batman is very much out there, and as we said, there are loads of good jumping in points for that. I think the major difference for me when I was looking at this X-Men one is, I think a lot of the jump, where we said with some of the Batman one, is you could do a lot of that more standalone. You can kind of jump in, enjoy that story, and then go, okay, like in a year's time, I'll buy another Batman story. Whereas I think with the X-Men, I think a lot of the jumping in points lead to you, if it gets its hooks in, you've got a lot more to buy.
Yeah, as I say, this seems to be very much a series,
Yeah,
not stories, as like with the Batman stuff. As I said,
yeah,
the only real series that we brought into the Batman one was the New 52 run,
yeah,
where everything else was standalone.
yeah,
Yes, they came. A lot of them were in the monthlies and that, but they were then collected as one story. That it's
yeah.
its own story and has
Yeah, this feels like it's got that
going
kind
way.
of, like, as you kind of dip into it, if you stay in it, it benefits from reading 100 issues of it. Whereas with Batman, like, you could very much skirt around the standalones and go, over 30 years, I could read 30 stories, but I don't need to read the 100 issues that were between this story and this story, because Batman is Batman. Whereas I
Yeah,
think the X-Men are often, these characters are often, um,
evolving.
yeah. I think that's the honest truth of it. Like, Batman, his costume may change, but like, at its core, he's the Dark Knight. He's the detective. I don't think he fundamentally is meshed with as much as these characters are and have been in some of those series.
But yes, there's definitely at least three that I think are going to be coming to my house at some point in the near future.
I mean, I know we said this on other ones, but if anyone's kind of watched this and gone, yeah, I would like to start, but even within like the five that you've given, what do you think the best place would be? Drop us a message, because what I'll probably do is I'd probably kind of go, what films do you like, what books do you like, and things like that, because there are some, as great as I think they all are, I think there are some different styles to them. So I think actually you might be able to stylistically match someone. And as I say, I think if I was going to pick, if you could only jump in at one point, as much as I think you'd love the Whedon one, I would pick the Grant Morrison one for you, because I think the Grant Morrison one would vibe with you the most.
Cool. Because the thing is, the ones I've got on my list was the Claremont Love and Madness one that you'd said
Yeah,
about, and the Whedon one. But I feel that Morrison one might have to
yeah.
go in there. I'm not too sure about Grand Design though, because I'm like, if I want to
Yeah.
do it,
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I think, like I said earlier, I think it's, in theory, it's a good starting point, because you get a great story told in a very different format. But yes, I think the downside to it is you see everything that happens, and
yeah,
I think there's 3 volumes of it, and I think very much it takes you from, so Giant Size X-Men and X-Men like 95. I think it takes you pretty much up to around issue 250. So in these 3 volumes, it kind of covers like sort of close to like 160 issues. So yeah, it might be spoilerific for some, but also I don't think many people are going to read 160 issues worth. So
no,
I think it still is a good jumping in point. And also, if you want to jump in later with things like New X-Men, and you kind of go, oh, I'm interested in what happened before, but I don't want to read a 15-year run. Again, it's a nice jump back point even to cover that stuff off.
Yeah, I think that might be one of those of if I sort of go balls deep on the Grant Morrison and then obviously the Whedon stuff, and then when I'm probably not going to do the Claremonts.
Yeah.
Then I'd probably look at that.
Cool. And also, I said about things like Days of Future Past and Dark Phoenix. Like, I don't recommend them as a starting point because I think they benefit from having the build up. However, if you kind of know, you know what, I'm not going to go back and read the whole run because that is takes time and money. As I say again, then I think you'll have, you'll get the flavour for some of that stuff anyway, and you could jump into them as individual stories. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend them being a start point.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Seddon. You're costing me money again.
We need to get you out on the street and start selling that body of yours, mate, to pay for it, I think.
So we will be back next week with what? We don't know yet. We haven't done our usual chat about it.
No.
We'll pick something after we finish recording and then plan from there.
Yeah.
But until next week, and we see each other again, get in your dark reading corners. Just enough light to keep reading the pages. Tell us what you are also reading in your dark corners.
Yeah, give us some recommendations. Now, I say give us some recommendations, bearing in mind what Chris has just said. Like, give me some recommendations because I don't have 85 collected volumes of X-Men to have to pick up in the next couple of months.
It's all right. There was a reason I didn't buy a place PS5.
Yeah, I might have to sell mine.
To get all comics.
Yeah. Well, and also they're bloody massive, so it takes up storage space for comic books as well. So it's got a double benefit getting rid of the PS5.
So until next time, as always, follow us, follow the show.
I'm going to point at where the bell would be if I ever bothered putting things like bells up. But yeah, I'm sure I've seen people go like that.
Obviously, watch the main show on a Friday. And until next time, good night.
Thanks for watching, and just remember, you can join the Cult of Egg by liking and subscribing to this YouTube channel. We release regular content where we talk about all things geek, all things pop culture, and all things that we're interested in. You can also come along and join the discussion on Facebook groups and Renaissance Cast, and you can join us on our Twitch channel where Stu regularly streams games. And if you'd like to support us, then please follow the link for the Patreon. Thanks very much.